Today we'll be talking about the autoimmune diseases, having laid platform in previous topics about the normal immune response. It is really quite marvellous that we don't have things go wrong more often when you look at how many players there are in the immune system. But sadly, sometimes things do go wrong and we get an immune response which is confused, misdirected if you like, turning not towards the bugs that the immune system was designed to fight, but instead to self structures. And auto means self, so self-immune is what autoimmune is. There's at least 100 types of autoimmune diseases, and it's really quite interesting and striking to ponder that 1 in 20 individuals have some sort of autoimmune disease. In fact, autoimmunity is amongst the top 3 causes of chronic illness in the community. When you think of anyone you know of who has rheumatoid, various types of chronic urticaria, etc., that's exactly what we're looking at. If I could just allude to the way the immune system develops. The immune system goes to school in a place called the thymus, where it's taught to tell the difference between self and foreign. Some of the cells wag school, if you like, and some of them then have the potential to target self structures. Thankfully, they are usually suppressed by various types of regulator cell. And I want you to keep that in mind because I'll refer back to it later on. But remember that we all have mischief cells and everyone has the capacity to have an autoimmune response given the wrong set of circumstances. The immune system, when it is activated, because it is carried through the blood, autoimmune disease can occur in any part of the body that's supplied by blood vessels, really. So if you think about it, you can get vessel inflammation itself, which is called vasculitis. There can be involvement of neurological structures such as multiple sclerosis or neuropathy, involvement of bowel structures, which celiac is a type of autoimmune disease triggered by wheat. Any organ you can think of, the immune system can target in certain circumstances where the perfect storm arises. So why is it that things go astray? Why is it that sometimes people have an immune problem where their body turns on itself? Well, we don't really know. There'd be a PhD or probably a Nobel Prize for the person who could answer that question. When we don't know the answer to a question like that, most medical practitioners will say, well, it's a combination of genes and environment. And indeed, that does apply here. You have to have certain risk genes to develop an autoimmune disease. If I were, for example, to take the case of celiac, 1 in 5 people have the risk gene for celiac, and yet out of those, only 1 in 20 ever get celiac. So you've got the gene, but then there's some environmental trigger. Lupus, it's well known that sunlight is a major trigger. How does that work? Well, ultraviolet light actually damages the DNA, which, as you know, is the structure in the cell, telling it how to construct new parts of itself. DNA damage can lead to the cell breaking down, releasing parts of the DNA, and then the immune system makes antibodies to those parts. And that's why later on we'll talk about how DNA antibodies and anti-nuclear antibodies are important. There are a number of other things that can play into it. We've found that, for example, levels of vitamin D are a very important player in your determining your risk of autoimmune disease. And so what we end up with is a type of immune regulation problem, because for every mischief cell, we've also got a regulator cell that's meant to put the brakes on and stop the mischief playing up. But occasionally, if you're in a weakened state or if you're suffering from exposure to triggers like sunlight, various hormones, or other factors, then the problem will be activated. Another good example of gene-environment interaction is the person with the risk gene called the shared epitope for rheumatoid. If they smoke, they're going to get rheumatoid, no doubt about it. And a similar thing happens with Graves. So to put it another way, we've got these three aspects that play together to cause the autoimmune problem. There's the defects in genes that control immune function and the handling and clearance of nuclear damage. We've got environmental factors, and one other very important environmental factor I omitted but should mention is estrogen. Remember that for autoimmune diseases in general, for every 10 people, 9 of them are women. And we believe that estrogen may well have a role. We've also got evidence from an increased propensity to flare various conditions like lupus if you take hormonal therapies. And then finally, we've got this immune dysregulation because, as I say, to your surprise, but true, we all have the capacity to make autoimmunity in our cells. All of us have mischief cells, but usually the regulators keep them under control unless they start to flag or are impaired in some way. Now, in a sense, I've been talking so far about an acute event of inflammation. So, for example, the person who presents with an acute rash of lupus, they've spent a big day in the sun, they've damaged the DNA in there. Often it's the face, often over the cheeks. They've damaged the DNA, that's been released. There's been an antibody response and a cellular response to that DNA breakdown, and they have then developed a rash. And often that'll go away, but the more you get these events, the more it can become chronic. And chronic inflammation is the scourge of modern life, I would argue. Indeed, it is hard to find a case of disease that doesn't have some sort of chronic inflammatory contribution to it. Even atherosclerosis, which we think of as hardening of the arteries, is really an active inflammation process involving invasion of various cells causing release of chemicals from immune structures. The allergy disorders we've mentioned, there's a thing called immune senescence, which just means aging of the immune system. And unfortunately, as the immune system ages, its capacity to control the mischief cells can sometimes be impaired. We've mentioned various other contributors, but I think it would be important to point out that often the person with lupus will be a female, they'll be in their childbearing age. The peak is around 25 to 45. Once you get past there, then that risk goes down. So that is, of course, contradictory to what I've just said about immune senescence. There are no rules that apply in every single case. I would also argue that lifestyle factors are extremely important. And as life moves from the comfort of lying in your bedroom playing Nintendo while your parents go out and earn a crust, you eventually have to grow up and start working and looking after your family, and slowly your body is taking hits from various directions. And I believe that the major triggers, or at least some of the major triggers, in addition to everything we've discussed, are lifestyle factors like stress, sleep disturbance, and aspects of the modern Western diet, which are designed to actually create a very bad metabolic status where there's obesity. And the obesity, interestingly, the fat cells make immune chemicals, and we see people, I've seen a whole string of people recently who've had bariatric surgery, which is where they've suddenly lost 30 kilograms because they've had gastric stapling, and their immune system, inflammation has gone. Adipocytes are very important, so and also the stress and sleep factors that I've discussed. When we come to signs and symptoms, what are you looking for when you ask, does this person have an autoimmune disease? And given that its prevalence is 1 in 20, it's a valid question to ask in a lot of instances. I would argue that it's virtually impossible to have an autoimmune disease unless you are fatigued. Fatigue seems to be a sort of common constellation, although of course it's very non-specific because we all get fatigued just through daily life. But fatigue is due to the release of the flu-like chemicals that mediate our response to viruses. But when this happens all the time, you get a person who's somewhat debilitated, somewhat restricted in their life activities, and everything becomes a chore. If you consider all of the potential organs that might be involved, we've mentioned lupus can target the skin. It can also target any of the organs. There can be neurological damage from MS, gut damage from ulcerative colitis or celiac disease, skin damage from various forms of blistering skin condition. So as I said, virtually anywhere we can think that there is blood flowing and lymphoid cells flowing, there will be a potential for immune problems. We see inflammation of the eyes, we see thyroid, which is a very common one. Rheumatoid arthritis, 1 in 100 people, lupus, 1 in 700, muscles, nerves, brain, lining of the tissues, and organs, all areas can be affected. Just as a final point, I often explain to my patients what may be a simplistic model. You may even feel it's too simple, but I do find that it gets the message across quite nicely, which is that we're all meant to have a full tank of chemicals. We're like a car, we need a tank full of these chemicals. The main ones are dopamine, serotonin, and noradrenaline. We think of these as some of the targets of the so-called antidepressants, but they don't just control that. We need full tank of these chemicals to control 5 things needed for everyday life, which is mood, energy, pain control, sleep, and immune function. Now, if the tank goes down, and that can happen through a range of factors, trauma, either physical or psychological, depletion, lack of self-care, lack of me time, bereavement, a whole host of things. Certainly work-life imbalance is a common cause nowadays. Then your tank drops and you are unable to control adequately one of those 5 things. So some people will present with fatigue, some with sleep disturbance, some with chronic pain called fibromyalgia, but others get a defect in the regulator cells that are meant to be keeping the mischief cells under control. They get taken out of action, and of course you get the autoimmune disease. So I think it's very important to keep in mind the holistic need for a holistic approach to autoimmune disease, and to keep in mind that it is a very, very broad spectrum affecting both organs, specific targets like the thyroid, but also systemic problems like the lupus condition. And of course it can be a relapsing, remitting condition, and often autoimmune conditions will occur in clusters. So in fact, it's one of those things that if you find one, you may well find others if you look. That would be the key thing I would leave with you, is the importance of trying to maintain a balanced life to give your regulator cells the best chance of controlling those mischief cells. But of course, that's easier said than done.